So welcome to this session about activism, journalism, and bias. I would like to start with a journalist that was famous in the 90s, one of the most prominent TV hosts and news anchors that we had in Germany. It's Joachim Friedrichs. And he was, let's say, also an influencer when it came to the standards of journalism. And one of his quotes is still discussed today. And the quote is the following: "You can recognize a good journalist by the fact that he keeps his distance from the subject of his observation, that he does not make himself common with a cause, not even with a good cause, that he is always there but never belongs to it." What Friedrichs delivers here is the traditional definition of what is expected from a journalist: to observe, to judge independently, and to avoid any kind of involvement. The argument that is always used to criticize Hans-Joachim Friedrichs is that this is impossible for a human being, that we are all human beings. And of course, this is true. Also, the journalist is a human being with individual feelings, attitudes, with opinions, right? Deriving, of course, as like anybody else, from the family background, from education, from peer groups, from living conditions, and so on and so forth. But in my opinion, the fact that we have individual attitudes does not contradict the journalistic ability to stay in a certain distance to the subject of observation. And I have two arguments for that. First of all, in journalism, there is space. There is space to express opinions, space to express attitudes. And there's a demand for that. And here I listed some types of articles that are used to express opinions and attitudes. First of all, it's reviews, of course. If you write about a book, if you write about a theater play, if you write about a movie, then of course you use your own opinions. Same is with commentary, if you want to comment on the political situation. The editorial, the editorial in magazines, an editor-in-chief usually introduces his or her magazine with an editorial. Sometimes in some publications, there's also space for satire. I myself wrote some political satires. And also, last not least, what is highly subjective is, of course, a portrait. If you write a portrait about someone, you try to get close to this person and you try to get into his or her thinking, into emotions and so on and so forth. But you end up in a double portrait. You write a portrait about someone, but you also portray yourself. That's normal, and that is also intentional. But for the whole rest of journalism, for instance, when you do investigations or when you write reports, there you have to really beat the monster of bias and subjectivity. And to beat the monster, you have a cluster of rules. And I'm just showing a few of them. It's not complete, this catalog, but a few and important rules. Avoiding conflicts of interest when selecting a topic. Of course, as a journalist, you cannot write about, let's say, well, a family member in a political decision, in a political position. It's impossible. If you report about the stock market, and you have shares yourself, you cannot report about the stock market. You should stop that immediately, and so on and so forth. You have to base your story on reliable sources and bulletproof facts. You have to research and integrate different perspectives on the topic, and you have to separate opinion from reporting. So there are opinionated pieces I showed you before, but here we are talking about reports and investigations. And of course, you have to, and this is a rule, you have to confront people who are criticized in the article and give them room for defending themselves. It's not possible to simply make allegations and to simply claim things without hearing the person that you are criticizing. Last not least, you have to obey the 4 eyes principle. And if you work in a bigger magazine, then you don't have a 4 eyes principle, but you have probably an 8 eyes principle, because your colleague is reading that, the leading editor is reading that, probably even the editor-in-chief is reading that, and a fact checker is reading that. And what happens when other people are reading your text? Of course, they start discussing it with you. And this has a moderating an effect that makes really harsh perspectives into modest perspectives. So in the best case, what it's all about, journalism, in the best case, journalists deliver an accurate picture of reality that helps readers to conceive an opinion and make informed choices. This is, so to say, what a journalist should do in an ideal world. Being an activist, and I was an activist, and I was talking to politicians, and I was in the European Parliament, and so on and so forth. Being an activist is really, really a different story. I tried to contrast, as I did already in the article for the wonderful magazine that Johannes prepared. I tried to contrast, so to say, the features of journalists and the features of activists in this slide, and to see what is different and where do we have overlaps. What you see in this slide is that most of the features differ from each other. And what you see in red here are probably the most important features. So how do journalists understand themselves? What kind of self-definition do they have? Usually, and I'm talking here hopefully for the majority of journalists, they see themselves as observers of social life and value neutrality. Neutrality is not the point for an activist. Activists see themselves as shapers of social life and society and value getting involved. The next point is a journalist does not represent a political agenda, also not a hidden political agenda. An activist pursues an open political agenda. So you should have your political agenda on your homepage. Everybody should know where you are engaged and what kind of goals you pursue. So you have an open political agenda with clearly defined goals. So, but what happens in practice? I mean, this is the theory, right? But what happens in practice? So I worked for a long time, for 11 years for this magazine, Der Stern. I worked there until 2016. And in 2020, having a new editor-in-chief and new strategies, how to reach target groups and so on and so forth, Der Stern started to overstep the border between journalism and activism. They invited a dozen of activists from Fridays for Future to collaborate on this special issue. So they had access. They discussed their topics with the editorial team. They influenced the choice of topics. They also influenced the wording, how to present the articles on the climate crisis. I think for the Stern, it was kind of a test balloon, if this works. If they could have more advertising for this issue, if they follow this approach, and if they could reach a younger target group. What happened was when they brought out this issue, they were really widely criticized in the German media scene. They were criticized for overstepping and blurring the border between activism and journalism. And in the end, the experiment failed, and the editor-in-chief had to leave also the magazine. What is more common is a cooperation between activism and journalism. This is a kind of job sharing, so to say. I think if you have the time, have a look at the book, The Mechanism of Impact by Christopher Hurd. Christopher Hurd is the chair of the Ethical Journalism Network. And he describes examples of cooperation. And he describes, for instance, in detail, a cooperation between Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the British TV station Channel 4 on the civil war in Sri Lanka. The NGOs back then provided footage of war crimes to Channel 4, and a documentary filmmaker who was under contract by Channel 4. And the documentary filmmaker produced a documentary called Sri Lanka's Killing Fields. And this documentary, which showed really gruesome pictures of war crimes, was embedded then in the campaigns of the NGOs, and the NGOs also organized screenings of this movie. And so it was shown in TV4, but it was also shown in independent screenings organized by the NGOs, and it was used as a tool for mobilization for this cause. What is probably the most common thing is that journalism reports about activism and thereby amplifies the results of activism. So what you probably know, what you probably have seen already a lot, is the map provided by Reporters Without Borders. It's on the left side here on the slide, showing the state of press freedom in Europe. And what you probably also saw is an activity by Greenpeace in Berlin in front of the Brandenburg Gate during the Fashion Week. And they made aware the public that fashion is now something like fast food. You can get it cheap, and if you don't like it, then you throw it away, and thereby you're producing a hell lot of rubbish. So from what I see is that the collaboration between activism and journalism and the blending is still, from a German perspective, quite limited. But then the question remains, and we talked about this question already, how does the bias come into, let's say, single articles, but probably also whole media outlets? So what is happening there? In Germany, you have a law that says that media outlets and publishing houses are Tendenzbetriebe. So Tendenz is tendency. the publisher has the right to fix a tendency, namely the political line of his company. To make that more clear, other Tendenzbetriebe in Germany, according to the law, are churches, parties, and unions. That means that they have a certain view of the world, and they do not only produce products to gain profit, but they also want to influence the public sphere. And this is why they are called Tendenzbetriebe. In a good publishing house, they make it open and they make it transparent for what kind of values they fight for. One of these publishing houses is Axel Springer Verlag in Germany. Probably you know it because, well, they are producing the biggest tabloid in Germany, the Bild-Zeitung, and also newspapers, and they also have TV channels. They have guiding principles, which are stemming from the founder of the publishing house, Axel Springer. And I just took two of them to illustrate what I mean. One of the guiding principles is we support the Jewish people and the right of existence of the state of Israel. And another guiding principle is we advocate the transatlantic alliance between US and Europe. This is why you always find in the Bild-Zeitung and in the Welt newspaper quite friendly articles when it comes to the US and when it comes to Israel. So Tendenzbetriebe is the one thing. The other thing, what happens in practice quite often is the following list. Advertisers can exert, of course, pressure by threatening media outlets to withdraw their budgets. I witnessed a case in one of the media outlets I worked for. It was a big car producing company that was not satisfied with one of the articles showing some deficits of the cars they produce. And they really threatened the editor-in-chief to withdraw the budget, the advertising budget, and we are talking about millions. So, and then you need an editor-in-chief and also a manager of the publishing house that has a certain backbone and that is ready to protect journalistic independence, even though it costs a lot of money. And then the question is on the table, is the publishing house strong enough or not? Does it have enough financial resilience? Second point, politicians can exert, of course, pressure when they capture media or when they exclude you from the communication. This is something that is also happening in Germany, of course, if you are super critical with one of the politicians. This politician might not invite you when he or she is traveling to another conference or to another important meeting. Others might join this group, other journalists, but you are not invited. This can happen. It can also happen that you don't get an interview. So that, for instance, a minister is refusing to give you an interview without telling you why, but just telling you, well, he has no time, or it's not the topic that he wants to talk about or she wants to talk about. The next point is, in polarized societies, most of the journalists are already perceived as biased because the other side calls them biased. So that's really, really a problem. So if you do a decent reporting, a fact-driven reporting, you reveal a scandal, whatever, the other side is calling you biased, and the other side is doing smear campaigns, and the other side is trying to rip off your credibility, and that has an effect on the public. The effect on the public is that consumers think every journalist is biased, and then the credibility of the media system dropped to a minimum. Last not least, of course, journalists can also be corrupt. We have the case of Hubert Seipel in Germany. Hubert Seipel, who was an acclaimed journalist and who won prizes for his reporting. He was specialized on Russia, and he was one of the very few journalists who seemed to have a direct contact and a direct access to Vladimir Putin. And Hubert Seipel was inviting Putin also for interviews and documentaries. And after years and years, it turned out that he got cash from the Russian government, and not 10,000s, but hundreds of thousands, officially to support the production of a book, for consulting and whatever it was. He got the money, he didn't make it that transparent, and it turned out that this also, of course, influenced his view on Vladimir Putin and the way he presented Vladimir Putin. Now I come already to my final slide, and the final slide is to illustrate probably the biggest dilemma of German media. But here I'm talking really from a German perspective. Maybe in other countries things had already made more progress. So the final slide is about a diversity. I worked in editorial offices where we had only people between 40 and 60, reporters between 40 and 60. They were all white. They were all academics. They were all belonging to the middle class, having a good income. And they were all living in, let's say, nice quarters of the capital of Berlin, right? So what they consider life and what they consider reality is really completely different from what you see in the countryside. For instance, also in the East, where you have dying towns and where you have really a problem with an aging population, and where you don't have the standard of culture that you have in the capital, of course, and so on and so forth. So what they see and what they regard as relevant is not the same as others regard relevant. And that creates, let's say, a world of topics that could be regarded as one-sided, and that makes it plausible that part of the public is feeling that they are not seen, they are not heard, that their circumstances of life are not reflected in the media. Yeah, that's it. In the best world, we don't have an equation, but an inequation of journalism, activism, and bias. But in reality, that's not the case, at least not always. Thank you so much.